E.T. here. Jack Johnson, heavyweight boxing champion between December 1908 and April 1915, remains big news among boxing fans today. But news about and concern for Johnson pretty much disappeared between June 19 of 36 and the mid-60s. Back in June of 36, former champion Max Schmeling knocked out Joe Louis. Before that, he'd knocked him down 3 times. And in the mid-60s, a stage play came out that resurrected the old champion, Jack Johnson. Why a loss for Joe Louis would cancel Jack Johnson 21 years after Jack lost his title? Well, that'll be discussed in a moment. But first, a bit of Johnson's life as champion. Although he was not the first to be a braggart like former heavyweight champion John L. Sullivan, who'd announced to anybody within earshot, "I can lick any SOB in the house," Johnson did lack any sense of humility in or outside the arena, and often mocked opponents while in the ring. He carried himself out of the ring like some unelected monarch, smoking the big cigars, driving the fancy cars that only the very rich could afford. And he also flouted accepted social practices of the day. Public disapprobation, or dislike, was so strong that Johnson would be jailed on a trumped-up charge for violating the Mann Act, something that President Trump posthumously erased from Jack's record. But that was a tad late. The damage was done already. And that damage spread beyond Johnson. That informal color line that had been drawn against black heavyweights, well, it was expanded. And this is because of the dislike for Johnson. It was expanded to include black fighters of all weight classes, which meant that men like Chappie Blackburn, a great lightweight, had no chance at a title. Well, Jack Johnson continued fighting until April of 1931. That's when he was barred from the ring in Kansas after registering a very fake knockout over one Brad Simmons. And after that, Jack went on to put on exhibitions. E.T. covered one in Spokane, Washington. And eventually he ended up making small change lecturing in New York City at Hubert's Museum, sandwiched between acts of a sword swallower and another, a fat lady. But when a genuine black prospect in the 1930s appeared, named Joe Louis, Johnson saw opportunity to be Joe's trainer. But Joe already had a trainer. His name was Chappie Blackburn, who understood that any black fighter associated with Jack Johnson would be so tainted that he'd never make it in boxing, let alone get a title shot. But also, Blackburn did not like Johnson. It seems the two had met long before. In fact, before Johnson became champion, Jack Johnson hired the much lighter Jack Blackburn for sparring, during which, according to Blackburn, Blackburn, made Johnson look foolish. So between that incident and Blackburn's constant telling of it, both men developed a lingering mutual dislike. Now we come back to June 19 of 1936, the day Jack Johnson disappeared from public attention. Here's the story. Joe Louis, unbeaten, a sure bet to become heavyweight champion, stepped into the ring with Max Schmeling, a former heavyweight champion, but considered pretty much washed up. The fight took place at Yankee Stadium in the Bronx. Before Schmeling versus Louis, Jack Johnson, who'd been appearing off and on at Joe's training camps, but he'd always be turned away, Johnson had spoken often about Blackburn's poor training, going so far as to say this, and I'm quoting Jack Johnson, "Joe Louis holds his left too low, and the first fellow who makes him step back and then throws a right at his chin will knock Joe out," unquote. words that irritated not just Joe Louis's camp, but most of New York's Harlem. But what Jack Johnson predicted happened, for reasons that Jack predicted, and Schmeling had already figured out. And Joe was knocked out, as I mentioned before, in round 12. But it was what Jack Johnson did later that erased him for decades from public discussion. Right after the fight, Johnson paraded around Harlem. He is holding up and flouting money in his hand, exclaiming to all within earshot, he won that money by betting against Joe Louis. Well, an angry mob surrounded Jack Johnson, who eventually had to be rescued by police. And from that time on, until the mid-1960s, Jack Johnson was pretty much forgotten, erased from public memory. The man about whom Ken Burns said was for more than 13 years the most famous, notorious African-American on earth became a vague memory until the release of Howard Sackler's stage play entitled The Great White Hope. And that, boys and girls, is the story. Did you like it? If so, tap the thumb up icon, subscribe, tap the bell to be notified of new uploads, and most important, comment below. You know the drill. Thank you.